For 320 years, humanity had been prey. Not soldiers. Not warriors. Not even a threat. Just prey. The Velhari came first in the year 2041, slipping through the dark between stars like silk through water. Their ships were silent, their technology so advanced it appeared to human eyes as magic. They did not come to conquer. They did not come to destroy. They came to collect. Specifically, they collected men. Young men, healthy men. Men who had not yet reached the peak of their strength. They called it the harvest, and the galaxy called it perfectly normal. See, the Velhari were not unique in this practice. Across 37 known sapient species, the taking of lesser races was considered art, an aesthetic expression of dominance, a cultural ceremony older than most civilizations. The Galactic Accord said nothing about it, because the Galactic Accord was written by species who practiced it. Earth fell into their radar in 2041 when a Velhari scout stumbled upon a small colony ship near Jupiter. The crew was scanned, assessed, and categorized in under 11 seconds. Category: livestock. Subcategory: livestock. Grade: exceptional. The scout reported back to the Velhari Council with barely contained excitement. Humans, it seemed, had a rare quality, a Velhari prized above all else. They were what the Velhari called Shivarel, which translated roughly as beautifully unaware, a creature that does not know it is beautiful, that has no concept of its own rarity. That was the most prized catch in the entire known galaxy, and humanity was drowning in it. The first harvest happened quietly, in a town called Briar Glen, Montana. On a Tuesday in October, 14 men vanished. No trace, no wreckage, no explanation. The FBI investigated for 6 months and found nothing. Local legend called it the Tuesday disappearance. Ufologists called it proof. The government called it a gas leak. The Velhari called it an appetizer. Within 2 years, harvests were happening across every continent. Always quiet, always clean, always men between the ages of 18 and 35. The world noticed, of course. You cannot make 50,000 people vanish without the world noticing. But governments were helpless. Military response was laughable. Fighter jets were simply redirected home by invisible hands before they ever saw a ship. Missiles veered off course and landed harmlessly in the ocean. Every satellite sent to track Velhari movement mysteriously lost signal at the critical moment. Humanity screamed into the void, and the void did not even bother to respond. By 2060, 22 years into the harvests, the world had changed profoundly. Demographics shifted. Policies changed. People adapted, as humans always do. Curfews were implemented in high-risk areas. Underground shelters were built. Men began wearing signal scrambling suits, designed hastily by MIT graduates who barely understood what they were scrambling. None of it worked. Not a single scrambler ever stopped a Velhari beam. But humanity kept trying, because that is the human thing to do. And the Velhari found this absolutely delightful. The struggling, the desperate innovation, the small futile gestures of defiance. To the Velhari, it only increased the beauty of the harvest. A creature that fights its capture, they believed, shows spirit. And spirit raised the value of the collection tenfold. In Velhari culture, a collection was a statement of status. The wealthiest Velhari families displayed their collections in crystalline stasis chambers. Row upon row of perfectly preserved humans, each frozen at the moment of capture. Each one a story, each one a masterpiece. The Velhari did not hate humans. They did not even dislike them. They simply did not consider them people. The same way a collector of rare butterflies does not hate the butterfly. They simply do not ask its permission. If you're enjoying this story so far, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who loves a great HFY tale. It helps more than you know, and there is a lot more story to come. By the year 2150, over 4 million men had been taken from Earth. The Velhari were not the only collectors anymore. 7 other species had discovered humanity and joined the harvest rotation. The Drenathae, insectoid beings from the Crux arm, favored young men for their muscle structure. The Salvani, crystalline organisms of barely comprehensible intelligence, collected humans for their emotional output. They had technology that could feed off human feeling the way humans feed off food. The Morven, a gas-based collective, collected humans simply because they found bipedal locomotion mesmerizing. Watching a human walk, Tay reported, was the most hypnotic experience in the known universe. And then there were the Karaf. The worst of all. The Karath were humanoid, physically similar to humans in build if not in face. They collected for sport, not to display, not to study, not to harvest energy from. They collected for the thrill of the hunt itself. They used beauty as bait. Karath drones could project perfect holograms of human women, calling out in familiar voices. Men would follow the projection down an alleyway and simply cease to exist on Earth. They called this game luring, and they held competitive tournaments with rankings and prizes. Earth became a hunting ground for the rich and bored elite of 15 alien civilizations. And through all of it, humanity adapted. The year 2161 produced the first major breakthrough. A woman named Dr. Yemi Okufer, working in a converted warehouse in Lagos, cracked something extraordinary. She had spent 11 years studying the vanishing patterns, the timing, the locations, the conditions. She had a theory that the harvests were not random. She was right. The harvest beams, she discovered, operated on a predictive algorithm. The aliens were not just grabbing people at random. They were calculating probability fields, identifying which humans were most likely to be alone, vulnerable, unobserved. The beam did not fire until the probability of intervention dropped below 4%. 4%. But that meant, if you could keep your probability of observation above 4%, you were safe. Dr. Okafor published her findings on a Tuesday morning, and the world changed by Wednesday. Within 6 months, the Constant Watch Protocol was born. Every community began implementing buddy systems, mandatory proximity tracking, public accountability networks. Nobody walked alone at night. Nobody sat alone in open spaces. Buildings were redesigned to eliminate blind spots. Cities reorganized around the principle of constant visibility. The harvest numbers dropped for the first time in over a century. The aliens noticed, of course. The Velhari Council convened an emergency session. They had not expected this level of adaptation. Most species, when harvested, simply fled or hid. Humans were doing something different. They were engineering their entire civilization around the problem. One elder Beladi named Shuvarath reportedly said, with something approaching admiration, "They are not hiding. They're restructuring reality to make hiding unnecessary." The council raised the sophistication of their approach. New beam technology could now harvest through walls, through crowds, even through partial observation. The 4% threshold was reduced to 1%. The harvest resumed. The numbers climbed again, but humanity had learned something critical from the Constant Watch Protocol. They had learned that the aliens used algorithms, and algorithms could be studied, and studied things could be broken. The year 2187 produced the second major breakthrough. A team of engineers in Chengdu managed to capture a Karath drone mid-lure. Not destroy it, capture it intact, operational, broadcasting. This had never been done before. The drone was disassembled over 3 years by the greatest engineering minds humanity had ever assembled. And what they found inside rewrote everything humanity thought it knew about alien technology. The technology was not magic. It was extraordinarily advanced engineering. Yes, centuries ahead of anything humanity possessed. Absolutely. But it was comprehensible. It followed physical laws humanity recognized. It used energy patterns humanity could measure. It was, at its core, just very, very good engineering. And good engineering, humanity had learned over 10,000 years of civilization, could always be reverse engineered given enough time. The first human-built signal disruptor, reverse engineered from the Karath drone, came online in 2203. It did not stop a harvest beam. Not even close. But it made the beam visible. For the first time in over 160 years, humanity could see when they were being targeted. The alert would sound and people had approximately 90 seconds to move into a harvest-proof shelter. The shelters were not particularly sophisticated. Dense lead, alloy walls, lined with a human-derived approximation of the Kareth shielding material. They worked about 40% of the time. 60% of the time, the beam adjusted, recalculated, and fired anyway. But 40% was infinity compared to 0. If this story is gripping you, please like this video, hit subscribe so you never miss an upload, and share it with a friend. We are just getting started, and what comes next will change everything. The year 2220, 179 years into the harvest. Humanity had lost over 12 million men. The demographic damage was catastrophic. The psychological damage was worse. Every male human alive had grown up in a world where disappearing was a real possibility, where going for a walk alone was a calculated risk, where your probability of observation needed to be actively managed at all times. It had changed humanity in ways that were both terrible and remarkable. The terrible parts are obvious. Anxiety disorders became so common they were considered baseline human psychology. Social isolation had become an almost mythological fear. Men formed tight, fierce communities bound by the simple shared understanding that isolation meant death. The remarkable part was this. Humanity had never been more collectively intelligent, because when survival requires engineering, engineering becomes culture. Schools had restructured entirely around problem solving, not test taking, not memorization, not credential accumulation. Raw, applied, creative, problem solving. A 12-year-old in 2220 could reverse engineer a combustion engine before lunch. A 15-year-old was expected to understand basic quantum field theory, not because education boards demanded it, because the children demanded it, because they understood, viscerally, that understanding physics was the difference between living and not. The generation born between 2200 and 2240 would later be called the Forged generation. They were harder, sharper, and more collectively brilliant than any humans who had come before. They were also furious, not the hot, impotent fury of earlier generations who raged and screamed at an enemy they could not touch. This was cold fury. Methodical fury. Fury with a plan. A young woman named Sarah Voss, born in Reykjavik in 2209, would become the architect of that plan. She was not a soldier. She was not a politician. She was a systems theorist. Her doctoral dissertation, published when she was 23, was titled, "The Harvest as a Solvable Constraint Problem, a Framework for Total Interdiction." The galactic community, had they been paying attention, might have recognized this as a warning. They were not paying attention. Voss's framework was simple in concept, staggering in execution. The aliens, she argued, were not gods. They were not invincible. They were large, complex, resource-dependent systems operating in a physical universe, and every large, complex, resource-dependent system had choke points. Find the choke points. Apply pressure. The system fails. The challenge was finding the choke points of species that were centuries ahead in technology. Voss's answer was, "You do not fight the technology, you fight the logistics." Every alien species that participated in the harvest needed to get to Earth and get away from Earth. That required approach vectors, entry points, exit corridors. Those corridors were physical. They existed in space. They could be mapped. The project to map them took 40 years, and the combined effort of every space-capable nation on Earth. Thousands of satellites, hundreds of small probe ships launched on suicide trajectories just to gather telemetry. Vast arrays of quantum entanglement sensors seeded across the solar system. 40 years of work. But by 2268, Sarah Voss, now 59 years old and the most important scientist alive, had her map every approach vector used by every harvesting species for the past 2 centuries, every exit corridor, every preferred altitude, every timing pattern. She could predict, with 91% accuracy, where a harvest ship would be at any given moment. The military implications were immediate and staggering. But Voss was not done Because knowing where the ships were was not enough. You needed to be able to reach them. And in 2268, humanity was still very much earthbound. This is where the Forge generation earned its name. Because in the years between 2240 and 2290, humanity achieved technological advancement that in any other context would have taken 1,000 years. They had the greatest, purest, most clarifying motivation in the universe. They were angry, and they knew exactly what they were angry at. The first human-built FTL-capable vessel launched in 2271. It was not elegant. It was not particularly fast by galactic standards, but it worked, and it was armed with something no alien species expected humanity to possess. A working approximation of the Velhari stasis beam, reverse-engineered from 40 years of captured drone components. The U.S. Okufa, named for the woman who had cracked the observation algorithm over a century earlier, made its first deep space run in the winter of 2271. It found a Velhari collector vessel in the outer system, a mid-sized craft on a routine harvest run, carrying 23 recently taken men. The engagement lasted less than 4 minutes. The Velhari collector crew was stasis-locked. The humans were freed. The collector vessel was taken intact. And the galaxy did not know yet, but the prey had just become the hunter. If you have not liked and subscribed yet, do it right now, and share this with someone who needs to hear this story, because what happens next is why we are all here. The Velhari Council learned of the Okafar incident 3 weeks later, through standard shipping reports. A collector vessel, long overdue, had been found adrift with its crew in stasis, and its cargo missing. The Council's first reaction was disbelief. Their second reaction was a taxonomy error. They searched their records for species capable of such an action. Humanity did not appear in the results. Because in Galactic Accord species records, humanity was still listed as categorium, livestock, subcategorium, aesthetic. No one had updated the file in 230 years. The Velhari dispatched an investigator. A single ship, 1 crew member, routine inquiry. The investigator's ship vanished in the asteroid belt. 2 months later, the U.S. Okafor again. Faster now. More practiced. The investigator woke up in an interrogation room in the UN security complex in Geneva. This was the first direct communication between a living alien and humanity in 230 years. The investigator, whose name in Velhari translated as something like third assessor of the Eastern Cluster, was reportedly not pleasant to deal with. He insisted, loudly, that this was a violation of Galactic Accord property law. The UN representative, a former military officer named General Ades Navusu, looked him in the eye and said, "We are no longer property. Adjust your records?" The investigator was returned to his species 3 days later, unharmed, with a formal written notice delivered to the Velhari Council. The notice was 12 pages long and extremely precise. It outlined, in exhaustive legal and technical detail, exactly what humanity had achieved. It catalogued every technology reverse-engineered from harvesting species. It described the stasis lock capability, the FTL drive, the approach vector mapping, the quantum sensor network. And at the end, in very simple language, it stated the following: the collection of human beings will cease immediately. Any vessel entering Earth's solar system without prior diplomatic clearance will be treated as a hostile combatant and engaged accordingly. We will not negotiate the right to exist. We will not petition for recognition. We are informing you not requesting your permission. The Velhari Council read the notice, conferred for approximately 40 minutes, and then made what would later be recognized as the worst strategic decision in galactic history. They sent a punitive fleet, not a massive armada, not a civilization-ending force, just enough to make a point, they believed. 14 collective vessels, fully armed, escorted by 2 Velhari military cruisers. The kind of force you send to discipline a colony that has forgotten its place. What met them at the edge of Earth's system was not what they expected. 112 human vessels of varying size. Not all of them armed in conventional terms, but every single one of them fitted with a full working suite of human-developed tech built on 230 years of studying Velhari, Karis, Dranati, Solfani, and Morvan engineering. The humans did not fire first. General Nuosu, commanding from the bridge of the UES Saravas, sent a single transmission. You have entered restricted space. You have 60 seconds to reverse course. The Velhari fleet commander laughed. At least, the translators interpreted it as laughter. He began charging his weapons. The engagement lasted 22 minutes. 3 human vessels were destroyed. 11 more were damaged. The Velhari punitive fleet did not return home. Not a single ship. 14 collector vessels and 2 military cruisers. Intact, captured, boarded, and added to the growing human fleet. The crews were stasis-locked and stored in the same crystalline chambers that had once held human beings. The galaxy heard about this. The Galactic Accord convened an emergency session within the week. 31 species, representing the most powerful civilizations in the known galaxy, gathered to discuss the problem of humanity. The proceedings were reportedly chaotic. Several species demanded immediate punitive action before humanity grew further. Several others pointed out, quietly, that humanity had already demonstrated it could engage and defeat Velhari military assets, and that perhaps the situation warranted careful consideration. One representative, from a small but ancient species called the Theory, reportedly said something that changed the entire tone of the proceedings. She said, "We are discussing how to stop them. Perhaps we should first ask ourselves whether we deserve to." The chamber went very quiet. The Theory were not a powerful species militarily, but they were the oldest species in the Accord, with records going back over 40,000 years. And in those 40,000 years, they had watched many civilizations rise, make a terrible error, and fall. They recognized the pattern. The Theory representative continued. She said, "We categorized them as livestock and harvested them for 230 years. We did not ask. We did not consider, we simply took. And in those 230 years, instead of breaking, they became this. Does the Accord truly wish to discover what 230 more years of war produces?" Nobody called for punitive action after that. What happened instead was something that had never occurred in Galactic Accord history. A species that had been listed as category. Livestock was reclassified. Humanity's new Accord designation. Category. Sovereign. Subcategory. Emergent threat. Status. Diplomatic priority. The first diplomatic vessel arrived at Earth in the spring of 2280. It was Velhari. The same species that had started all of this, partly because they had the most to answer for, partly because they were, quietly, the most frightened. The Velhari ambassador was an elder female named Shuvar, a descendant of the same Shuvarath, who had noted with admiration, over a century ago, that humans were restructuring reality. She stood in the UN General Assembly Hall in New York, before a room full of the most powerful humans alive. And she did not make a speech. She made an apology. A formal, legally binding, culturally catastrophic apology under Velhari tradition. In Velhari culture, a formal apology of this magnitude required the apologizing party to acknowledge, in detail, every harm caused. It took 4 hours. 4 hours of a very old alien woman standing in front of the people her species had treated as objects for 230 years and naming every wound. The number of people taken, the communities destroyed, the generations scarred, the psychological architecture of an entire civilization built around the terror of disappearance. When she finished, the room was silent for a very long time. Then, General Nuasu, sitting in the front row, stood up. She was 67 years old. She had commanded the battle that ended the Velhari punitive fleet. She had grown up hiding with her brothers in a signal-scrambling basement in Lagos. She looked at Shuvar for a long moment, and then she said, "We accept. Now let us talk about what comes next." What came next was complicated, imperfect, and frequently infuriating for everyone involved. But it was talking, and talking, for the first time in 230 years, was real. The negotiations lasted 11 years. If you are still with this story, please like, subscribe, and share right now. We are near the end, and it is worth it. 11 years of the most complex diplomatic process in human history, because humanity did not simply want an apology and a handshake. Humanity wanted the architecture of the galaxy to change. The Galactic Accord's property laws, the ancient conventions that had allowed the harvest to happen, had to be not adjusted, not amended with special exceptions for humanity, rewritten, root and branch. Every species, listed or unlisted, recognized as sovereign by default. The harvesting civilizations resisted, of course, some of them loudly, some of them with thinly veiled threats. But humanity had spent 11 years of diplomatic negotiations backed by a fleet that was growing, learning, and improving every single month. By the time the new accord was finalized in 2291, the human fleet was not the largest in the galaxy, but it was widely considered the most tactically innovative, because humans had built it the same way they had built everything since 2041, not from a position of comfort or complacency, from a position of absolute necessity, channeled through 250 years of collective fury and grief, expressed as engineering. The new accord came into force on March 14, 2291. Every sapient species, regardless of technological level, recognized as sovereign. The harvest, and all practices like it, classified as crimes against sapient life, enforcement mechanisms written with teeth, monitored by a joint council that included human representatives with real veto power. It was not perfect, nothing that involves 31 species with wildly different concepts of morality, biology, and history ever is. But it was done. In the UN General Assembly Hall, when the last signature was placed and the new accord was officially ratified, the room erupted, not in the dignified, restrained way of diplomats, in the raw, loud, uncontrolled way of people who had waited 250 years for this moment. General Nusu, now 78 years old and newly appointed as humanity's first Galactic Accord ambassador, sat very still in the middle of the chaos around her. She was thinking about Briar Glen, Montana, about a Tuesday in October, 250 years ago, about 14 men who went to sleep and did not wake up, about the woman who figured out the algorithms and the woman who mapped the corridors and the thousands and thousands of humans who had spent their entire lives building the ladder that humanity had just climbed. She was thinking about her brothers, both taken when she was 12, taken from that basement in Lagos, despite the scrambler, despite everything. She was thinking about what it had cost, about what the number 12 million actually meant when you stopped counting and started imagining. 12 million individual moments of terror, 12 million last breaths of Homer, 12 million families with a hole in them that never closed. She was thinking about all of that when the theory representative, the ancient small woman who had changed the accord session with 8 quiet sentences, sat down in the empty chair beside her. The theory looked at her for a moment, then sighed in her careful way. "Your species is extraordinary, you know." Nuasu did not look at her. She was still looking at the room. She said, "We know." The theory was quiet for a moment. Tensa Said, "I've watched 40,000 years of sapient history. I have seen many species face what your species faced." And Nuasu said, "None of them did this," the theory said simply. Nuasu finally turned and looked at her. Most species, when systematically harvested, did one of 3 things. The theory continued. They fled to the edges of their world and hid. They shattered psychologically and regressed, or they fought and died and were forgotten. Bao said. You did none of those things. You adapted the structure of your civilization. You turned your fear into engineering. You turned your grief into mathematics. You took 230 years of being treated as objects, and you used it to build this. She gestured at the room. The signatures. The new law. The changed galaxy. Nuasu was quiet for a long time. Tensa sighed. We had a choice every generation. Keep running or keep building. You kept building, the theory said. We kept building, Nuasu agreed. Outside the hall, in the city, in the country, across the planet, across the expanding bubble of human space that stretched now 17 light years in every direction, people were celebrating, not the loud, uncomplicated celebration of victory. Something quieter, something that had to share space with grief. You cannot celebrate 250 years of horror without the celebration being complicated. But you can celebrate. You have to celebrate, because 12 million people were taken and could not be returned, but they would be remembered. And because of what their taking had forged, what it had built, what it had made of the species that survived them, no one would ever be taken again. Not from Earth. Not from any world. Not anymore. That was the deal. That was the new law. That was the line drawn in the mathematics of the universe itself. The galaxy had mistaken humanity's beauty for helplessness. It had mistaken their unawareness for weakness. It had looked at a species that laughed and loved and built and sang and decided it was seeing livestock. What it had actually been seeing, though it would take 250 years to understand this, was a species at the very beginning of what it was becoming. And what it was becoming was something the galaxy had never seen before. Not the strongest, not the fastest, not the most technologically advanced, but perhaps the most stubbornly, creatively, furiously, beautifully alive. The kind of alive that does not accept its own extinction. The kind of alive that takes every blow and turns it into a lesson. The kind of alive that grief cannot extinguish, and terror cannot stop, and 250 years of darkness cannot put out. Humanity, still here. Still building, still, against all calculation and all probability, still here. If this story moved you, please like this video, subscribe to this channel, and share it with everyone you know. Stories like this exist because of you. Thank you for watching. Thank you for being here. We will see you in the next one. The new accord was signed, but the galaxy did not instantly become a peaceful place. Peace on paper and peace in practice are two entirely different things. Humanity understood this better than anyone, because they had spent 250 years learning that understanding a problem is not the same as solving it. The first year after the new accord was ratified, there were 11 violations, 11 incidents of species attempting harvests on worlds they considered too remote to be monitored. Not on Earth. Earth was untouchable now and everyone knew it, but on smaller worlds, younger civilizations, species that had no fleet and no voice in the accord. Humanity noticed, because one of the things 250 years of being prey teaches you is how to recognize predatory behavior from a very long distance. General Nuosu, now formerly Ambassador Nuosu, raised every single violation in the Accord Council chambers, loudly. With documentation, with the kind of precise, furious clarity that only someone who had grown up hiding in basements could produce. Some representatives were annoyed. Some were embarrassed. A few, privately, were relieved that someone was finally saying these things out loud. The theory representative, as always, said nothing publicly, but found Nuasu afterward in the corridor. She said simply, "Keep doing that," Nuasu said. "I intend to." The enforcement mechanisms of the new accord were tested for the first time in 2293. A Drenathi, collector vessel, operating in the outer regions of a star system called Kethsaven, was caught. The victim was a pre-FTL species called the Sueri, small insectoid beings who had no concept that other life existed in the galaxy. From their perspective, 17 of their people had simply vanished during a migration season. They built shrines to the missing. They invented gods to explain the absence. They had no idea. The human patrol vessel UES Briar Glen, named deliberately, found the Drenathi collector at the edge of the Sueri system. The collector crew argued they were outside New Accord enforcement range. The UZ Briar Glen's captain, a 29-year-old from Nairobi named Idris Waruru, responded with one sentence. He said, "There is no outside our enforcement range. Move away from the planet or we will move you." The Drenathi moved. The 17 Suri were returned to their world. They woke up in a field they did not recognize and walked home and assumed they had been dreaming. They built a new shrine. This one, unknowingly, was to something real. Word of the Krevan incident spread through the galaxy faster than any diplomatic communique, not because of the confrontation itself, because of what Captain Waru did afterward. He filed a full report with the Accord Council. Yes, standard procedure. But he also personally compiled a record of every Suri taken in the past 40 years, cross-referenced with Drenathi shipping logs obtained during the vessel's boarding. Names, approximate ages, last known locations. He sent this record to the Accord's new victim registry, a human-proposed institution that most species had considered unnecessary. After Krevan, no one called it unnecessary again. The registry became the most important office in the Accord within a decade, because it turned out that when you actually documented the harm, when you gave it names and faces and specific moments of loss, the galaxy found it considerably harder to look away. Humanity had insisted on the registry because humanity understood this instinctively. They had 12 million names of their own. They knew what name grief could do to a civilization. They knew it could either destroy you or forge you, and they intended to make it forge the galaxy the same way it had forged them. Please take a moment right now to like this video. Subscribe if you have not already, and share this with someone who needs to hear this story. Your support keeps these stories alive, and we have much more to tell. The year 2295 brought something unexpected. Not a threat, not a violation, not a diplomatic crisis. A request from the Velhari, specifically from a young Velhari engineer named Veth, who could not have been more than 30 years old in human terms. She sent a message directly to the Human Engineering Council, bypassing all diplomatic channels. The message was short. It said, "I have been studying human FTL drive architecture for 2 years. I believe I have found an efficiency improvement that your engineers may have missed. I would like to share it. I am not asking for anything in return. I just think it should exist." The Human Engineering Council debated for 3 weeks whether this was some kind of trap. Then a young engineer on the council, a woman named Dr. Petra Host, who had grown up hearing stories about the Forge generation, said something that ended the debate. She said, "If we refuse to learn from them, we are doing to them what they did to us. We are deciding in advance what they are capable of." The council voted to accept the meeting. Veth's improvement was real, not incremental. Significant, a 17% increase in drive efficiency based on a mathematical approach the human team had considered and discarded 3 years earlier as too complex to implement. Veth had found a way to implement it. The collaboration that followed lasted 4 years and produced 6 separate published papers, co-authored by human and Velhari engineers, that became foundational texts in galactic propulsion theory. It was the first time in recorded Accord history that a formerly harvesting species and a formerly harvested species had produced joint scientific work. The theory representative, when told about this, reportedly sat down very slowly and was quiet for a very long time. "Tense aside, I have watched 40,000 years of history. I have never seen that before. It would not be the last time." Because Veth was not alone. Across the Velhari civilization, a generation had grown up in the aftermath of the apology. A generation that had learned, in uncomfortable detail, what their parents and grandparents and great-grandparents had done. Some of them responded with denial, some with shame that curdled into resentment. But some of them, the ones who would matter, responded with a question. The question was, what do we do now? And the answer, increasingly, was to look at what humanity had built and learn from it. Not steal, not harvest, not collect. Learn. The way students learn. The way peers learn, with permission and acknowledgement and the understanding that the knowledge came from somewhere real and cost something real. By 2300, there were 47 active joint research programs between human institutions and institutions from formerly harvesting species. This was not universal harmony. There were protests on both sides. Humans who believed collaboration was a betrayal of the 12 million. Velhari conservatives who believed the apology had been a catastrophic display of weakness. Drenathi factions who openly stated they still did not believe pre-FTL species were truly sapient. The world, the galaxy, was complicated. It was always going to be complicated. But complicated and progressing is infinitely better than simple and static. And the direction of travel, for the first time in 250 years, was genuinely forward. Ambassador Nwasu gave a speech to the Full Accord Council in the spring of 2300. She was 87 years old. She had survived for assassination attempts from species that considered her an existential problem. She had outlasted 3 Velhari Council administrations and 2 complete restructurings of the Accord. She had the kind of presence that fills a room not through volume but through absolute, unassailable gravity. She stood at the council podium and she looked out at 31 species and she said this. She said, "I was 12 years old when my brothers were taken. The room was very quiet. I spent the next 50 years trying to understand why. Not emotionally, technically, operationally. I wanted to understand the system well enough to break it. We broke it. You knew this. You were there. But I want to tell you what I learned in those 50 years that nobody talks about in the official histories." She paused. "The thing that saved us was not the technology, not the engineering, not the fleet. It was the decision made by ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances to keep trying, millions of times, across 250 years, in basements and labs and classrooms and vessels and council chambers. Ordinary people deciding every single day that today was not the day they stopped. That is what we built. Not ships, not weapons, not legal frameworks. We built a civilization of people who do not stop. And I want every species in this room to understand something." She looked slowly around the chamber. "We are not going to stop now. Not for you. Not for your comfort. Not for the species that find our presence in the galaxy inconvenient. We are going to keep building. We are going to keep learning. We are going to keep showing up in that registry with names. And if any world in this galaxy finds itself being harvested, being collected, being treated as an object by those with more technology and less conscience, we will be there. Because we know what it costs not to be." The chamber was silent for a long time after she finished. Then the theory representative began to strike her small hands together. It took the translators a moment to confirm. She was applauding. By the time the translation confirmed it, she was not alone. If you are moved by this story, please like this video right now, subscribe to the channel, and share it with everyone you know. We are almost at the end, and it deserves to be heard. The year 2320, exactly 279 years after the first harvest. Ambassador Nwasu was 107 years old, and still working, because the advanced medical technology that had emerged from the Forged generation's fury at losing people soon had extended human lifespans considerably. She was slower now. She used a chair that moved without wheels, a quiet piece of engineering her grandniece had built for her. But her mind was as sharp as it had ever been. She was sitting in her office in the Accord complex on Theory Prime, the ancient world that had been chosen as neutral ground for the Accord headquarters, when the alert came in. A new system. Far out, near the edge of mapped space, a species just beginning to develop radio communication. Pre-FTL. Pre-space flight. Barely aware of the scale of the universe, and a Karath hunting vessel had just entered their system. Noisu read the alert, and then she did something that surprised her young aide, a 22-year-old from Bangalore named Arjun, who had grown up on stories of the Forged generation. She smiled. Not because it was good news, because of what happened next. Before she had even reached for her communicator, she had 17 incoming messages. From the captains of human patrol vessels already in the region, from the Accord Enforcement Office, staffed partly by humans, but increasingly by representatives of species that had learned, watching humanity, that enforcement actually mattered. From the Victim Registry, already beginning to prepare documentation protocols for people who did not yet know they needed protecting. And one message, which made her stop and read twice, from a young Velhari engineer, Nodveth, who was now middle-aged and running her own research institute. A student of Veth's. A Velhari who had grown up reading the joint papers, who had spent her education in a world where the Accord had teeth and human engineers were colleagues, and the harvest was a historical crime studied with shame. She had heard the alert through a Velhari monitoring channel. She had sent a message to the Accord Enforcement Office volunteering her vessel, a small research craft, for support duties. She wrote, "I know I am not military, but I can be a second set of eyes. Tell me where to go." Nwasu read that message for a long time. Then she forwarded it to the enforcement coordinator with a single note attached. The note said, "This one. Remember this one." The Karath Hunter was intercepted 6 hours before it would have reached optimal targeting range of the planet. 3 human vessels. 1 Accord enforcement craft crewed by Zuuri. Yes, the same small insectoid species from Keth 7, who had joined the Accord 9 years earlier once they achieved basic space. And 1 small Velhari research craft, running sensor sweeps from a safe distance and feeding real-time data to the intercept team. The Karath Hunter stood down without engagement, because they knew what happened to Karath, who did not stand down. Because the precedents were well established by now. The pre-FDL species on the planet below had no idea any of this had happened. They went about their day. They watched their sunset and their moons rise, and they told each other stories about the nature of the universe. Some of those stories imagined beings among the stars. None of those stories imagined what was actually out there. A fleet of mismatched vessels, crewed by multiple species, guarding a planet whose inhabitants did not know they needed guarding. Not because it was profitable, not because it was strategically advantageous, because 279 years ago, 14 men vanished from Briar Glen, Montana, on a Tuesday in October, and nobody came. And humanity had decided, in the long crucible of that absence, that the correct response was not to wait for someone to come. The correct response was to become the someone who comes. Arjun, watching from Nwasu's office as the intercept reports came in clean and the Karath vessel turned and left the system, said quietly, "We did it." Nwasu looked at the data feed for a long moment. "Tensei Said, we did it today. Tomorrow we do it again." He looked at her. She looked back at him with the calm, absolute certainty of someone who has spent a century doing exactly this. "That is the job," she said. "There is no finish line. There is only today and tomorrow and the day after." "Does that bother you?" he asked. She thought about her brothers. She thought about the 12 million. She thought about Briar Glen and Lagos and Reykjavik and Shundu, and all the ordinary places where extraordinary things had been built by people who refused to stop. She said, "No. It does not bother me at all." In the Accord Council chambers, the new Accord's 5th review session was underway. Every 5 years the full council gathered to assess enforcement, amend where needed, and hear reports from the victim registry. The registry report this year was different from every previous year. For the first time since the registry had been established, the number of confirmed violations was 0, not close to 0. Not trending toward 0. 0. No confirmed harvest activity anywhere in known space for a full calendar year. The registry director, a quiet man from Snow Polo named Marcus Andrade, read this number into the record without emphasis. He did not celebrate it. He did not say it was permanent. He said, "This is 1 year. We will report again in 12 months. That was the right thing to say. Everyone in the room knew it, but in the corridors afterward, in the small private moments that official records do not capture, people let themselves feel it. The theory representative, who had seen 40,000 years of history and never before witnessed a formerly harvested species rewrite the laws of the galaxy, sat alone in a small garden on the Accord complex grounds. She sat there for a very long time. She was thinking about the Tuesday in October, 279 years ago. She had been alive then. She had known about Earth. She had said nothing. Most of the older species had said nothing, because it was not their problem, or so they had told themselves, because the Accord did not cover livestock, because the categories were the categories and changing them meant acknowledging that the categories had been wrong, and no one wanted to acknowledge that. She had been one of those no ones. She thought about that a great deal. She thought about what it had cost. That silence. 12 million people, a civilization built on terror. 250 years of grief folded into engineering, all because no one had said, early enough, loudly enough, clearly enough, "This is Doblerona, and we will not permit it." She had been the one to say it eventually, in that emergency council session, when humanity had already done the work themselves. It had been too late to prevent the cost. She had said it anyway, and it had mattered a little. She hoped, sitting in that garden, that the lesson would hold, not just for humanity, for everyone. For the species watching from the edges of the Accord, still deciding whether to join. For the young Velhari engineers and the Suuri patrol crews, and the countless others who were building, slowly, a galaxy that functioned differently than the one she had watched for 40,000 years. She hoped they understood what it had taken to get here. She hoped they would remember. She was still sitting in the garden when Nuasu's chair moved quietly along the path and stopped beside her. The two old women sat together for a while without speaking. Then the theory said, "What do you think comes next?" Nuasu looked up at the stars visible through the transparent dome above the garden. She said, "More of the same. Problems. Solutions. People who refuse to stop. You are not worried." "Always," Nuasu said. "But worried and stopped are different things." The theory was quiet for a moment. "Tensesai, you know. In 40,000 years, I have watched perhaps a dozen species achieve something truly unprecedented. Something that had never happened before in the history of sapient life in this galaxy. We were one of them." "Nuo?" "Susaid. You were the most recent," the theory said, "and the most unlikely." "Why unlikely?" "Because the others who achieved unprecedented things did so from positions of strength, from civilizations that were already vast and old and powerful. You did it from nothing. From the bottom, from being listed as livestock in a registry. You did it by being relentlessly, stubbornly, impossibly yourselves." Nuasu smiled. "That sounds about right," she said. "Please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share this story with everyone you know. It means the world. And we are coming to the very end now." The last harvest ship captured by human forces was a Morvan vessel, seized in 2318. The Morvan. Those gas-based beings who had collected humans simply because they found bipedal locomotion mesmerizing, had been the last holdout. Not because they were particularly powerful, because they were genuinely confused by the concept that their practice was harmful. To a being of diffuse gas and collective consciousness, the idea of individual suffering was genuinely difficult to process. It had taken years of careful, patient, exhausting diplomacy to help the Morvan understand. Not argument. Not force, not threat. Genuine communication across one of the widest biological gaps in the known galaxy. The human diplomat who had led that effort, a linguist named Dr. Songwei, had spent 9 years learning to communicate with Morvan in their own medium. Not words, not images, not mathematical concepts. Emotional resonance. The Morvan, it turned out, fed on emotional states the way humans fed on food. Dr. Songwei had learned to project, with extraordinary precision, the specific emotional frequency of grief, not described grief. Felt grief. She had stood in a Morvan translation chamber and let herself feel, fully and completely, what it meant to lose someone to the harvest. She had let them consume that feeling, and for the first time in Morvan history, they had understood what they had been doing. The Morvan Elder Council's response had not been words. It had been a broadcast of grief in return. The translators had called it the closest thing to a genuine apology they had ever recorded from a non-humanoid species. Dr. Songwei had sat down on the floor of the translation chamber and cried for a long time. When she emerged, she told her team that the Morvan would be signing the new accord. Her team had asked how she knew. She had said, "Because they finally understand what it costs, and no one who truly understands the cost chooses to keep paying it." She had been right. The Morvan signed in 2317. The last Morvan collection vessel, carrying its seized cargo, was returned to Earth space, and the humans aboard were freed in 2318. Of the 12 million taken across 279 years, the vast majority could never be returned. The technology to reverse long-term stasis, to restore the physiological and psychological damage of captivity across decades or centuries, simply did not exist in early 24th century capability. But some could be helped. The most recently taken, those in less advanced stasis systems. Over the decades, following the new accord, in a program that would continue for generations, 31,000 men were recovered and returned to Earth. Most of them were disoriented. Many were damaged in ways that took years of careful support to address. All of them were alive. The reunion program was handled with extraordinary care by people who understood, viscerally, what it meant to be returned to a world that had changed around the shape of your absence. The last recovery happened in 2341. A man named Thomas Breyer, 23 years old at the time of his capture, and he had been in Valhari stasis for 297 years. He woke up in a hospital in what had once been called Glasgow, surrounded by medical staff and counselors and arranged around the room with careful, contained hope. 3 generations of his own family. People he had never met who shared his face. He had been taken 3 years after the first harvest. He had been among the first. He woke up near the last. He spent a long time looking at the window before he said anything. Outside, the city was unrecognizable to him. The technology, the architecture, the sheer scale of what humanity had built in 297 years. When he finally spoke, he said, "Did we win?" His great dash, great dash, great dash. GRANDNIECE. A 12-year-old named a days. Because families remember names that matter, was sitting closest to the bed. She took his hand. She said, "Yes." He closed his eyes. He said, "Good." That was the end of the harvest, not with a battle, not with a speech, not with the signing of a document, with a 12-year-old holding the hand of a man born 3 centuries before her, with one word, with the simplest and most complete answer to the most important question. Yes, we won. In the years that followed, humanity continued doing what humanity does, building, engineering, arguing, creating, grieving, celebrating. The fleet expanded. The diplomatic corps deepened. The joint research programs multiplied. The Suari, those small insectoid beings from Ketsavan whose 17 taken members had come home not knowing why, sent their first diplomat to the Full Accord Council in 2330. She was young, brilliant, and had clearly studied human diplomatic history in exhaustive detail. Her opening statement to the council was entirely in standard Accord formal language, except for one phrase at the end. She said, "In imperfect but unmistakable human standard, we know who came for us. We have not forgotten." Ambassador Nosu, now 117 years old, and still technically retired, and still technically in that office every day, heard about the statement from Arjun, who was now himself a senior diplomat. She smiled. She said, "Good. Neither have we. There is a memorial on Earth, in the center of what was once called Briar Glen, Montana, on a quiet hill that looks out over a valley that has not changed much in 3 centuries. It is not elaborate. It is a wall of names. 12 million names, carved in stone, listed without rank or status or category, just names. The memorial was built in 2295, after the new accord was signed. It was proposed not by a government or a committee. It was proposed by a 12-year-old schoolgirl in what was once called Montreal, in a letter to the Accord Council that went accidentally viral across the entire Human Information Network. She had written, "If we do not write their names down where everyone can see them, then it is like it did not happen." And it did happen, and we should not let anyone forget that it happened. The council built the memorial. The girl, grown up now, worked at the victim registry. She had done exactly what she said. She had made sure no one forgot. Every year, on the 14th of October, the anniversary of the first harvest in Briar Glen, humanity paused, not in grief only, in something more complicated than grief, in acknowledgement tisa penet. Penet. This is what it cost. This is what we built from the cost. These are the names. We remember. We do not stop. That was the memorial. That was the tradition. That was the thing humanity carried forward. Not hate, not fear, not even pride. Exactly. Something quieter than pride. The knowledge of what they were capable of. The knowledge earned in the hardest possible way, paid for in the highest possible currency. The knowledge that when the worst thing happens, when the universe shows you exactly how small and vulnerable and categorized and dismissed you are, when everything says stop, you do not stop. You adapt. You build. You name the dead. You go back to work. And eventually, after 279 years and 12 million names and every ordinary person who refused to be an ordinary ending, you win. That was the human story. It was not a clean story. It was not a comfortable story. It was not a story that ended without scars, but it was a true story. And true stories, unlike the ones that Velhari told about beauty and collection and the right of the powerful to take from the small, true stories do not end with a trophy on a shelf. They end with a 12-year-old holding the hand of a man who woke up after 300 years and asking one question and getting the only answer that ever mattered. Yes. We won. If this story meant something to you, please like this video, subscribe to this channel, and share it with everyone you know. These stories exist because of you. The names are remembered because of you. Thank you for watching. We will see you in the next one.